It's great to be with you again today. My name is Jason Dexter. Today we are continuing our study of the book of Daniel, and we are in Daniel chapter 6. This is the story of Daniel and the lion's den. It's one of the most famous stories in all of the Bible. Probably you heard this story many times, perhaps in Sunday school as a child, and you've seen many pictures of Daniel in the lion's den. But what does this passage have to do with us? What are the principles which we, even as adults, can learn that we can apply to our lives today? I believe that in this story, God is teaching us some very, very important truths on how to live for Him in the midst of a dark world. So it's very applicable to us today in the culture that we live in. And I hope that as we study through this book, Daniel chapter 6, the principles you learn today will change your life. So we are going to start with Daniel chapter 6, and we'll read verses 1 through 3. We'll be breaking this chapter up into several sections and discussing them one part at a time. So, Daniel 6, 1 to 3. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be throughout the whole kingdom, and over them 3 high officials, of whom Daniel was one, to whom these satraps should give account, so that the king might suffer no loss. Then this Daniel became distinguished above all the other high officials and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. So this is soon after the events of Daniel chapter 5. In Daniel 5, Daniel came in to tell King Belshazzar what the hand writing on the wall meant. And Belshazzar raised him up to third in command of the kingdom. But then the same night he was killed and the Persians came in. So Daniel is probably now a little bit over 80 years old. He served in a very high position in Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom. He served for one day as number 3 in Belshazzar's kingdom. Both of these were Babylonian kings. But now Persia was in control. And so we see that the conquering king comes in, and very soon after that, he's putting Daniel into a high position. And we see in verse 3 that he's planning on putting Daniel basically to be into the second in command position over the kingdom. So why would a conquering king establish Daniel, someone whom he has conquered, in such a prominent position? Evidently, Daniel had a very good reputation. He was known as a person who is full of integrity. He was known to be wise and faithful, to be a loyal leader. Now, the king wanted to find rulers who would protect his interests. And notice that the goal for the king in placing these officials was so that the king might suffer no loss. Daniel fit the bill. So he served as a top official before in at least 3 different administrations spanning about 6 decades. Daniel was a good employee with a good testimony. He brought real value to his employers. And we see in the story of Daniel how the cream rises to the top. Daniel was a faithful employee, and so he got many promotions. Also, of course, because God was with him. So how do we apply this to our life? Well, are you a good employee like Daniel was? Do you have integrity like he did? Do you faithfully serve your boss's interests? As Daniel did, we often work for bosses who are not necessarily believers, for companies that don't necessarily honor God. How can we serve God while still being a good employee? Well, from a worldly perspective, a Christian employee might have negative and positive sides. The negative side is the Christian employee probably will not blindly obey everything that the boss tells him to do, even sinful things. As we see, Daniel, even in this chapter, will not just obey the king's orders because they were wrong. The Christian accountant should not be willing to change the numbers. The Christian salesman should not be willing to exaggerate or to lie to show how good a product is. And the employee who loves Jesus should not be a slave to his work and to make that into a higher priority than his own family. But if your boss only sees the downside to having a Christian employee, you may not last long in your job. There should be a positive side too. That is, as an employee who follows Jesus, you should be trustworthy. You should be honest to your boss and to your company. You shouldn't cheat the customer, but neither should you cheat the company or exploit or abuse your relationship with your boss. Good employees should arrive on time and should work hard. Now, once I noticed a program on a website, this was CBS Sports, and this was watching for the NCAA men's basketball tournament every March. Now, one of the advertised features of this program was that it had a boss button. So you would be watching your favorite sports team compete in the tournament, and then if you click this boss button, it allowed the watcher to immediately close the video screen, and then a fake spreadsheet would actually open up at the click of this button. So it was designed to encourage people to watch while at work, but do this in secret without permission from the company. And then when the boss walked in, just press the boss button and he won't even know. He'll see this spreadsheet and think you are hard at work. Well, that is stealing from the company. A Christian employee should work hard even while the boss is out of the room. Now, we see that Daniel was actually faithful to his bosses, although they were not believers. He cared for them and he protected their interests. Other officials served their own interests and selfishly pursued personal gain. But Daniel would not be corrupted. He wouldn't take a bribe. He wouldn't cook the books. He was a faithful employee. And because of that, we see that he was promoted again and again. Proverbs 22:29 says, "Do you see a man skillful in his work? He will stand before kings. He would not stand before obscure men." As believers, yes, we need to put God first, even above our companies. However, as we put God first, this will develop in us a character that will be beneficial to the company because we are working hard and we're being diligent for our boss. We want to create value for the place where we are working. And we see Daniel doing that throughout the book of Daniel. Now let's go forward, verses 4 through 9. We see that the king planned to give Daniel another promotion. But then it says the high officials and the satraps sought to find a ground for complaint against Daniel with regard to the kingdom. But they could find no ground for complaint or any fault because he was faithful, and no error or fault was found in him. Then these men said, "We shall not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God." Then these high officials and satraps came by agreement to the king and said to him, "O King Darius, live forever. All the high officials of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the counselors and the governors, are agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an injunction that whoever makes petition to any god or man for 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document, so that it cannot be changed, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked." Therefore, King Darius signed the document and injunction. So we see here that a righteous person will face opposition. Daniel faced a lot of opposition from the other political leaders. We should not be surprised by that. 1 Peter 5:8 says, "Be sober-minded, be watchful. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour." Do you know who Satan wants to devour the most? He wants to devour believers who have good testimonies. A good testimony for the Lord is a powerful tool to draw others to the Lord. And a believer with a good testimony is like a lighthouse, bringing ships in through the storm to a safe harbor. Satan wants to snuff out that light. Now, his first method is often to tempt believers to get them to fall away. We saw this back in Daniel 1 when Daniel and his friends were tempted to eat the food. And the next is he will try to then get rid of the person. If his temptation doesn't work, he would just try to silence them in some way. Now notice in this passage that all of the other officials were united against Daniel. They came together to make this scheme. Now actually they did tell a bit of a fib here. In verse 7, they came to King Darius and they said, "All the high officials of the kingdom, the prefects, the satraps, the counselors, and the governors are agreed." All are agreed. Is that true? Of course, it's not true because Daniel certainly was not consulted and he certainly did not agree. So they actually lied to the king to make it look like they were in total unity when they weren't. But they together came to the king and requested a new law, a law forbidding prayer to anyone except him for 30 days. There were a total of 120 satraps and 3 administrators. Now, presumably 122 out of these 123 together stood against Daniel. No one spoke up in his defense. Not one of them is recorded to have disagreed with their plan. These were career politicians. Now, these people, surely many of them hated each other and disliked each other. But in this case, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. They were friends because they had a common enemy. A believer with a strong testimony may attract opposition from many sides. We should not be surprised by that. 2 Timothy 3:12 says, "Indeed, all who desire to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted." So did you know that persecution is promised? Now, if you live for God, it says you will be opposed. Now, a lot of believers, they like to claim God's promises. We claim the promise of answered prayer. We claim the promise of forgiveness or promises of provision and so on. Did you ever claim the promise of persecution? Did you ever say, God, you said that those who desire to live a godly life will be persecuted. Where is it? Please bring that. Well, this may not be our favorite one, but it's there to prepare us that we will be ready when that moment comes. If you're not ready and if you're caught by surprise, you might not have the resolve or the perseverance to face that persecution and to endure. So actually, much of the battle you will face will take place in your mind before the persecution even comes. To have that commitment for the Lord, that you are willing to face that, you are willing to sacrifice for Him and to face the consequences. Now, opposition may come from different sources. Perhaps a parent who's opposed to your belief. Perhaps a coworker who's out to get you. Perhaps a government that's hostile to believers. Or it could be persecution from the majority people group in your country. Know that if you live a godly life for the Lord, you will be opposed. Now, maybe you say, I've never been opposed. I'm popular everywhere I go. Everybody likes me. If that's the case, then perhaps you might be too much like the world. Because if we are living for the Lord, we are not living as the world lives, that is bound to draw some criticism or some hatred from the world around us. So what is the application? Don't be surprised when you're persecuted for the gospel. Right now, before that intense persecution comes, dig your root deep into Christ and His Word so that when it comes, you will have a solid foundation. Don't be like the seed which fell upon the rocky soil and grew up very joyful and excited, and then persecution comes, and then it wilted away. How can we do that? Well, you can practice right now also. Stand up for right in everyday choices. And when you make little choices each day to stand up for what's right and not to compromise, then when bigger tests come your way, you will be better prepared to make the right decision. Now, the other thing that we see in this passage is that Daniel was blameless. They said in verse 5, we shall not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel unless we find it in connection with the law of his God. And in verse 4, it says they could find no ground for complaint or any fault because he was faithful. No error or fault was found in him. Now, the people surely tried very hard. They must have tried to spy out Daniel's secrets. Their investigations probably would have included checking his projects, his paperwork, asking questions of his coworkers, even going through his house to see if they could find a hidden stash of money that he'd taken in bribe, looking through his possessions. You know, throughout history, political adversaries are often very good at bringing up the secret sins of their opponents. Now, most investigators turn up plenty of dirt, and that's why there's a saying, everyone has a skeleton in his closet. Well, Daniel didn't. No skeleton in Daniel's closet. Although they tried as hard as they could find nothing, even remotely shady in Daniel's personal or professional life. In fact, the only thing that they could find to accuse him of, get this, is that he is too zealous in service of his God. The only area that they could find to accuse him is saying he's too radical of a believer. He's too faithful to God. Isn't that amazing? Isn't that an amazing testimony? This shining testimony was not an act. It wasn't faked. He wasn't one person at the office and then another person at home. He wasn't one person at church and another person in front of his friends. He wasn't one person on Sunday, or in his case, Saturday, the Sabbath, and then another person the rest of the week. Daniel was the real deal. This is who he was. He was a righteous person who lived like it no matter who was watching. How can we apply this? Well, put yourself in Daniel's place for a moment. Imagine there's a team of detectives investigating your life. Their goal is to dig out your secret sins. They want to expose you. They want to prove that you're a different person during the week than on Sunday. So they dig. What will they find? If they were to check your credit card bills and banking account history, what would they find that you spend your money on? What would they find out about your truthfulness if they look at your tax records? If they were to look at your internet browsing history, what would they see there? If they were to check out the movies that you watch or the music you listen to, the books that you read when no one else is around, what would they discover? If they were to observe how you treated your family members when you're at home with no one else around and recorded a video of it, would you want to play it on church on Sunday? It's at church on Sunday. If they could even go deeper, if they could go into the thoughts of your mind and then record what you think when you're all alone, what would they find? Now think for a moment about if someone really investigated your life, what you'd be most afraid of them finding. That is the thing that you need to take to the Lord, to confess and to repent. God can help you be righteous. Now, no one's perfect. Daniel is not perfect. We are not perfect. God's grace is sufficient. Jesus' forgiveness can cover all of these things. And yet we should desire to live a godly life with a good reputation and to be consistent in our walk with the Lord. Titus 2:7 says, "Show yourself in all respects to be a model of good works, and in your teaching show integrity, dignity, and sound speech that cannot be condemned, so that an opponent may be put to shame, having nothing evil to say about us." That is what we should strive to do, to show ourselves in all respects to be a model of good works, to live our life the right way, to be a good testimony before others. Now, when we look at these men and the way that they talk to the king, they say, "Oh, King Darius, live forever." And then they basically tell him, look, we want to make a law that no one can no one can pray or make a petition to any god or man for 30 days except for you. So they use flattery, they use manipulation to achieve their desired result. So we should be careful not to let ourselves be manipulated by flattery. This king goes along with their request probably because he was somewhat puffed up and thought, wow, I'm really important, I'm really special. And so he went along with what they said. And this king also made a rash promise. He agreed to make this law, but he didn't consult his best advisor, Daniel. The king should have he should have rejected it right offhand, but if he even considered it at all, he should have taken more time to consider it instead of just rashly agreeing to their deal. And he didn't really consider its ramifications. He didn't even take time to think, what about Daniel? How will this affect Daniel? So they proposed to make man a god for 30 days by royal decree. Who knew such a thing was possible, to say this man is now God for 30 days because we decree it to be so? Well, such an idea was sure to appeal to his ego. After all, his loyal subjects clearly adored him so much, it was only right that he bless them with the opportunity to show their sincere affection. He was truly kind-hearted. These officials knew how to manipulate the king by stroking his vanity and his ego. Now today, such a law seems insane and likely to invite immediate revolt. However, in the ancient world, it was common for emperors to be worshipped as deities. Jesus responded to Satan, who asked for his worship, by telling him to depart from me and to worship the Lord your God and serve him only. Some governments now demand a near worship level of devotion. In Revelation, we learn that in the end times, the one world government will demand that level of devotion and will in fact demand worship for its leader, the Antichrist. So throughout history, one of Satan's most tried attacks is to get people to replace God. I think for most of us today, we wouldn't even consider doing such a thing, to pray to a man. But is there something else which we might make an idol of? Maybe ourself, maybe money, maybe hobby, maybe evolution, or maybe a person. Would we agree to follow these things for a period of 30 days rather than the Lord? Is there something or someone in your life which is vying for your highest allegiance? So verses 4 through 9 show us that a righteous person will be opposed. Let's continue from verse 10. We will see that a righteous person stands boldly on his convictions. When Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he went to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber open toward Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as he had done previously. Then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and plea before his God. Then they came near and said before the king concerning the injunction, O king, did you not sign an injunction that anyone who makes petition to any god or man within 30 days, except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? The king answered and said, the thing stands fast according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be revoked. Then they answered and said before the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or the injunction you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day. Then the king, when he heard these words, was much distressed, and set his mind to deliver Daniel. And he labored till the sun went down to rescue him. Then these men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, Know, O king, that it is a law of the Medes and Persians that no injunction or ordinance that the king establishes can be changed. Then the king commanded, and Daniel was brought and cast into the den of lions. The king declared to Daniel, May your God, whom you serve, continually deliver you. So, what does Daniel do when he hears about the decree? Well, he does the same thing that he always did. He doesn't change at all. He doesn't compromise his faith. He doesn't hide. It says in verse 10, when Daniel knew the document had been signed, then he went to his house where he had windows, and he got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as he had done previously. He didn't change. He didn't compromise. And from this, we learn we always have a choice. No one can make you sin. The story of Daniel proves this to be true. It looks like Daniel had no choice. Here he is, an old, frail man, once again, as he did when he was a youth, standing up against the most powerful king in the world. Most people his age would just want to live the rest of their days in peace. But I don't believe Daniel did this with the goal to make a statement. It wasn't like he did it in anger or in pride. I think he did it just simply because that's who he was. He wouldn't and couldn't change his very nature. He'd been praying this way for decades, so for him to do it again was the most natural thing in the world. Now, Daniel also, he didn't change his behavior and then try to justify it. He could have justified changing his routine just for these 30 days. After all, a person can pray anywhere, right? A person can pray with his eyes open. A person can pray with the door shut. Daniel could have gone to his bed and closed his eyes and prayed when he was laying down on his bed, and no one would have been the wiser. No one could have accused him. He could have avoided the wrath of the king and the accusations of the officials. He could have kept his job and his ability to influence people in the future. It would have been so easy. He certainly knew that he could have done these things, but he still went and prayed in front of an open window. Why? Why didn't he choose a less confrontational way to worship God for these 30 days? Would it have been right for Daniel to change his routine and pray secretly for 30 days until the decree expired? What do you think? Write down your thoughts in the comment section about this question. Could Daniel have changed his routine and prayed with his eyes closed on his bed, or prayed with his eyes open somewhere and still kept his faith but changed his visible routine to avoid being thrown into the lion's den? I think Daniel was a man of conviction, and changing his routine would appear to compromise. things. He would have lost his testimony and his moral authority. Now, it's likely that Daniel's influence was instrumental in the decree that was soon to be coming, that the Jews were allowed to return after their 70-year captivity. Now, we know God's sovereign. We see that the decisions we make are also important, and they have far-reaching consequences far beyond what we can see. James 4:17 says, "So whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for to him it is sin." So Daniel's conscience told him that he couldn't give in on this point, that he must keep on doing what he did and praying to the Lord. And so he did, even though he knew it might cost him his life. He didn't compromise. That's a very important lesson for us as well. How is the Holy Spirit leading you? What is he telling you to do in those situations? And what does his word say? We learned 3 things from Daniel. First, he was bold. He did it in front of an open window without fear of the consequences. Second, he had faith. Every time in the past he took a leap of faith, God caught him. He lived his entire life up to that point with faith in God, trusting that God would take care of him. And each time God did. So when you jump and God catches you, your faith gets stronger. For me, when I was teaching my boys to swim and they were on the edge of the pool, I said, "Jump in, I will catch you." And at the beginning, they were quite nervous. But then they finally got up the courage and they jumped, and I did catch them. Fathers, please do catch your boys or your children when you promise to do it. So I did catch them, and then that gave them more confidence and faith. And so the next time I said, "Jump and I'll catch," and I caught them, and they had more faith. And then maybe later they had too much faith and just jumped when I wasn't even looking. So when we have faith, we take that leap of faith in the Lord. He is faithful, and that builds up our faith in him for the next time. And third, Daniel had conviction. He had a clear sense of right and wrong. He didn't let fads or opinions of the day sway him. He stood firmly on the truth, unflinching, because he knew that he was in the right. Are you a person of conviction? We need to carefully study the scriptures and build up a foundation of principles which we can build our life upon and stand upon no matter what. Now, many of these convictions are different than the world's opinions, and the world's opinions change. They change one day to the next. They change 1 year to the next. Our opinions will probably be tested and opposed. But a conviction is a strong belief in your heart you should not compromise, no matter what others say. We should have strong convictions to do what we say, even if it is going to cost us. I remember once when I was a child, my father didn't have a regular job, and he took an odd job to build a fence for somebody. And the person said, "Will you take such and such a price to build this fence for me?" And my father agreed. And he agreed not knowing that under that person's property, a few inches under the soil, was this rock. Now the problem is this rock stretched across the entire lot. So when my father started digging fence posts, he found he couldn't do it because there was this rock blocking the way. So it took him way, way longer than what he expected. Now, a lot of people, when they started digging the first fence post and realized the amount of work it was going to be to build so many fence posts through solid rock, would have probably quit or gone to renegotiate. But my father realized the verse which says that if you make a promise, you should keep it, even if it's to your own hurt. And he decided to continue on and do it anyway. He ended up having to rent some special equipment like a jackhammer, and it took him weeks, much longer than he expected. He actually lost money on the job because he had to rent this special equipment. But he did it because he had a conviction that he should do what he promised to do. We should also have a conviction on God's word, on the principle of God's word, that on that we will not change. And sometimes it will cost us, but we need to do it anyway. Proverbs 20:25 says, "It is a snare to say rashly it is holy, and to reflect only after making vows." Don't make a rash promise. Don't sign a contract without reading it. Don't make important decisions because of pressure put on you. Take the time to think, to pray, and to ask counsel. So the king, he didn't do this. He didn't think through the ramifications of this new law. He just made a promise. And then he realized, or he made a decree, then he realized this was a mistake, but it was too late. Daniel, on the other hand, knew what he was signing up for when he decided to go ahead and pray into this open window and face the consequences no matter what it would be. So the Persian law was that after a law was made, then it couldn't be revoked or changed. And part of this was probably because they viewed the king as infallible. The king never makes a mistake, so why allow a law to be changed? Now, the inherent pride and ego in this law are clearly evident. Everyone obviously makes mistakes. It would be wise to allow for a method of repealing a law that is no longer suitable or was made with poor judgment. It's better not to make guarantees if you can avoid it. But here they guarantee, say, every law we make, we're going to keep it forever, basically no matter how dumb it is. We need to be careful. So instead of making promises and then later regretting it and breaking your word, then let's just say if it's the Lord's will, we will do this or that. That's what James says in James 4:15, or that we will probably do something. So just be careful. Let us be careful not to make the mistake that this king made to make a rash vow or promise. All right, let's go forward in the story to see what happens next after Daniel was found out. The king, he tried his best to have Daniel delivered. He actually didn't want to punish Daniel. He didn't want to execute Daniel. He realized the trickery after this law was made, but it was too late and it couldn't be changed. Otherwise, he might lose his government and lose his support if he broke these thousands of years of Persian tradition and history. Now, verses 17 through 24 tell us that a righteous person is not abandoned by God. The king says, "May your God deliver you." I don't know that he really believed that God could or would deliver him, but it seems to be like a hope. There's nothing I can do. Maybe your God can do something. Verse 17. And a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet and with the signet of his lords, that nothing might be changed concerning Daniel. Then the king went to his place and spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and sleep fled from him. Then at break of day the king arose and went in haste to the den of lions. As he came near to the den where Daniel was, he cried out in a tone of anguish. The king declared to Daniel, "O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions?" Then Daniel said to the king, "O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lions' mouths, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him. And also before you, O king, I have done no harm." Then the king was exceedingly glad and commanded that Daniel be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no kind of harm was found on him because he trusted in his God. And the king commanded, and those men who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and cast into the den of lions, they, their children, and their wives. And before they reached the bottom of the den, the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces. So Daniel was forsaken by the king, who felt he had no choice but to follow the law and have Daniel thrown to the lions. But he was not abandoned by God. These were lions that were probably purposefully starved in order to make them as ravenous as possible. And we see when the next people were thrown in, they ate them very, very quickly. So it wasn't just some fluke or they weren't hungry that day. It says in verse 22 that God shut the lions' mouths because I was found blameless before him. Now, Daniel doesn't sound the least surprised. And why should he be? God is in the business of doing miracles. He miraculously caused Daniel and his friends to look healthier after only 10 days in chapter 1. He miraculously gave Daniel the interpretation to Nebuchadnezzar's dreams in chapter 2 and 4. He miraculously delivered Daniel's friends in Daniel 3. He miraculously wrote on the wall to prophesy about Belshazzar's downfall in Daniel 5. What are a few lions to God? This should build up our faith in the Lord, that he will not leave us, he will not forsake us, he will not abandon us. Now this lion's den was not a scene from a children's storybook. Some pictures portray the lion's den as a pretty little place with light streaming in and Daniel pleasantly conversing with the lions or using them as a pillow. The lion's den was not that pleasant. It was meant to be a place of torture and death, likely dark, rank, filled with human bones. It was supposed to be frightening. The text describes a stone being rolled over and placed on the top, so likely there was no windows and no light. The scene makes us recall the words of David hundreds of years before in Psalm 23:4. He says, "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me." As God did not abandon Daniel to the lions, he will not abandon you either. God still does miracles. He still intervenes on behalf of his people. No matter what dark valley you're going through, remember God is there with you in the middle of it. No matter how lonely or abandoned you feel, know that God will never leave you or forsake you. No matter who stops loving you, God will never stop. Daniel here is vindicated. Verse 21 and 22, he says that he was vindicated because God knew that he was blameless. And by the way, O king, I have done no harm to you either. He didn't apologize. He didn't make excuses. He took the opportunity to use his influence to reach out to the king, to preach God's saving power, and to remind the king that I was loyal to you. And even more, I was loyal to God. The king is very happy. And then the king commands that Daniel's friends, Daniel's enemies, the one who threw him in to the lion's den, should be punished. Verse 24, their families and their wives, their children were thrown in to the lion's den. The ones who conspired against him were punished in exactly the same way that they desired for Daniel, which reinforces the biblical principle that you reap what you sow. Now, certainly it was good for the kingdom to get these officials out of leadership because they so opposed God. Now, we should take note of an important rule of biblical interpretation. This is a recording of the history. It's saying this happened. This is what this king, who was not a believer in the Lord, chose to do. It's not an endorsement that this was the right thing to do. The Mosaic law actually forbid executing children for their parents' sin or executing parents for the children's sin, basically saying that every person was responsible for his own choices. This king executed the families for the sin of these corrupted, politicking officials. And this would have gone against the Mosaic law, but we should take note this was a pagan king who didn't follow the Mosaic law. At the same time, this reminds us that you do reap what you sow. If you sow the right types of seeds in your family, in your work, in your church and neighborhood, you will reap a blessed and fruitful harvest. Now, what we see happening is that this time the lions did what lions do. They overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces before they even reached the bottom. Okay, so it's not about the lions were having an off day, or they were sick, or they were tired, or they were hungry, or they were weak, or anything else. This was a miracle from the Lord. And even if God did use some natural means to deliver Daniel, it would still be just as miraculous. So, moving on from verse 25 through 28, we see that a righteous person makes a difference for the Lord. It says, "Then King Darius wrote to all the peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth. Peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in all my royal dominion people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions." So this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Only days before, the king had proudly declared himself to be a god and demanded prayer from his subjects and forbade prayer to anyone or anything else. Now he does a complete 180-degree turn, and he commands the subjects to fear and to revere the God of Daniel. He says people are to tremble in fear before the God of Daniel. And then he says that God is the living God, that God endures forever, that his kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. And by the way, that is one of the key themes in the book of Daniel, that kings rise and fall, that leaders rise and fall, that kingdoms and dominions rise and fall, but God's kingdom endures forever to the end. And so God used this situation with Daniel to impress this lesson upon the king of Persia and also upon everyone in the entire kingdom. So the king not only seems to be convinced of this, but he issues a decree proclaiming this for circulation throughout the whole kingdom. So Daniel's choice not to compromise made a difference over the entire kingdom. How many lives were touched and changed because of Daniel's firm faith? This was a beacon of light which went out across all of these Gentile nations. Now, many Jews' lives would have been changed as well, because now they again had some kind of protection under the law. But not only Jews, many Gentiles across the nations would have heard this and had an opportunity to know the real God, Yahweh. Not only were many lives changed then, but lives are also still being changed almost 2,600 years later because of Daniel's choice not to compromise. And many scholars believe that the Magi who went to visit Jesus after his birth were familiar with the Old Testament scriptures and Yahweh, largely because of Daniel's influence in the Persian kingdom. So we see a result of all of this. Daniel prospered. He almost gave his life, but in the end he prospered. Now it may be that when you choose to serve the Lord, you'll be persecuted. And it may be that God may not deliver you in the same way that he delivered Daniel. He may not prosper you physically right now in your life on this earth, but he will see, he will not forget, and you will also reap what you sow. You will receive God's eternal reward when you choose to obey him without compromise. So what do we learn from this passage? When we make a stand for God, it will make a difference. It helps us to grow in our own spiritual journey, and then it becomes a light toward the people around us, a light which can hopefully bring them to know the Lord. Small actions of obedience to God can make a great difference in his kingdom. So to have a little bit of review about our passage today, we learned that a righteous person is a good testimony. A righteous person faces opposition. A righteous person boldly stands on his convictions. A righteous person is never abandoned by God. And a righteous person makes a difference for the Lord. I hope in the coming days and week that you will boldly stand on convictions that are formed from Scripture, and that you will be willing to stand on those no matter what opposition you may face, no matter what cost may come, knowing that God is there and sees, and he'll reward you for those choices. As Daniel chose to pray even when it was illegal to do so, let us continue to serve God even if the country that we live in makes rules or laws which make it costly to do so. Because these countries, these governments, these rulers rise and fall, but God's kingdom will endure forever. He is on the throne of thrones, so he is the one we should live to please. I hope that this lesson on Daniel chapter 6 was encouraging to you and will help you become bold in your walk with the Lord going forward. Please join us next time as we study Daniel chapter 6. God bless and hope to see you then.